Today, we are joined by Elizabeth Hobson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Cincinnati. Prior to her appointment at the University of Cincinnati, Elizabeth also held postdoctoral positions at the Santa Fe Institute and at NIMBUS, the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis. Elizabeth's research focuses on behavioral ecology, cognition, and some of the most difficult problems, measuring sociality and gauging its impact upon behavior. Elizabeth employs a variety of advanced computational and experimental methods to get at this challenging problem. And her talk today is titled Dominance Hierarchies, Fight Decisions, and Social Support as Windows into Animal Social Cognition. So thank you very much for joining us, Elizabeth. And before the virtual clap and round of applause, I'd also like to mention that Elizabeth has generously made herself available for an extra bonus round at the end of our normal Beck time today at 1:30. We'll have another half hour there. So if you feel like continuing the conversation and chatting some more with Elizabeth, you can join us then from 1:30 until 2. Okay, so with that, I'd just like to say welcome to Beck, Elizabeth, and we're very pleased that you could join us here today.
Great, thanks so much, Brian, and I really appreciate the invitation. And yeah, I'm really excited to be talking with you today. So the plan for today is I want to show you a couple examples of how I blend empirical approaches into understanding animal sociality and cognition with these more computational approaches to get insight into animal decision making. So to do this, I really like to bring sociality and cognition together in order to understand what animals need to know in order to act in the ways that they do that we can observe in the real world. So I'll highlight some very new results linking sociality and cognition in the parakeets. And what I'll do today is show how these new patterns fit in with our previous results to give us more insight into how this one species builds and functions within its social world, and then finish with a broader perspective on how we can use comparative studies to understand these links between sociality and cognition more generally. So I do have the chat open and I can see it during the talk. So if any questions come up during the talk, feel free to drop them in the chat and I can answer them in real time. Can always interrupt. And I look forward to a lot of questions at the end. It's great to have a longer question period. Great, okay, so one of the things that I find really fascinating about sociality is this real balancing act between the benefits that animals can get from being social, weighed against the costs of things like intra-group competition. And this balancing act can look very different across different species and different conditions. But let's take one example. So in something like these lions, right? Two individuals may be forming affiliative bonds with each other. They may be then cooperating with the same individuals to repel something like this external threat here, the stranger male from their group. But then they may turn around and compete with those very same individuals for access to limited resources. And so the thing that I think is really cool about this kind of social system is the more that animals know about their social worlds, about the relationships between all the individuals that they're interacting with, the better they can potentially balance the costs and benefits of being social. And what we're finding more and more is that in many animal societies, social relationships with particular individuals can have really strong effects. So strong effects on fitness, for example, but tracking and managing these social relationships may be cognitively challenging. And traditionally, this has led to a lot of hypotheses that link these two ideas together, like the social brain hypothesis, where the computational demands of sociality are linked to a need for greater cognitive capacity. All right, but there's a major assumption that underlies a lot of these hypotheses. And that assumption is that sociality is hard, right? And that is harder than other demands like foraging and other kinds of things that animals have to do. But what we don't know is that we don't know the cognitive load of sociality for almost any of these species. We don't even actually know what animals even know about their social worlds and about each other. And so it makes it really critical to understand these links between what kinds of information are understood and in use in the populations, and cognitively how that information is getting processed in different species. And depending on the species, cognition can be a critical part of social interactions and understanding how and why animals are making decisions about who and when to interact with each other. So in systems where cognition is a critical part, you can think of it as a cycling between information creation and decision making, right? So animals are interacting with each other, creating information and collecting that information, but then processing it on the cognitive side and using that information to make the next decision about who they're interacting with and how. Once they do that interaction, that creates more social information in the system that could potentially be used to make future interactions. So you get this kind of sawtooth pattern that cycles between what the animals are doing on the social side that we can observe and what they're doing on the cognitive side, this black box that we can try to infer what's going on in there based on their decision-making process. And that's what got me really excited about these links between sociality and cognition, is that although this process for the animals goes in one direction, from information to decision-making and back to information, what we can do as researchers is drop into these systems and drive that process backwards and say, okay, here's how the individuals are interacting. What kinds of information do they need to know in order to act in those ways? Okay, so that's really led me to focus on three major questions for my research program. And all of these kind of link these ideas about sociality and cognition together. And I like to think of these as generally linking these two aspects across lots of different species. So what I like to think about is three major questions. So what do animals or individuals know about their social worlds? How do they perceive, process, and store this information? And then how can they use this information to make decisions? And this perspective of starting with the questions and thinking about generalized approaches to sociality and cognition across lots of different species is reflected in my lab group, where, as you'll see in this talk, I do love a great network diagram. So here's my lab group as a network. And you can see that although I started my group recently in 2019, we already have a lot of people working on a lot of systems. And so today, what I'm going to focus on is our work with the monk parakeets. And I'll focus on mainly our work around aggression, social conflict, and rank and hierarchies, right? Because who doesn't like a good fight? All right. So what I'm going to pitch to you today is that aggression, conflict, and social dominance can be used as a model system to study these feedbacks between sociality and cognition. And so, and I think we have somebody who needs a mute on the other side. Okay, so what I want to focus on today is how I've been using the parakeets and their aggression and their hierarchies as a window into this animal social cognition and these ideas that I've been introducing here. So what I'll do today in the talk is first give you an overview of dominance hierarchies in general, as well as the parakeet system more specifically. And then what I'll do is we'll look at results at two social scales. So we'll start with the individual scale and ask whether, a simple question, right? Is rank predicted by individual characteristics, or is it more likely to be an emergent social property of the group? Then explicitly at the group level, what we'll look at is whether we can experimentally test whether small changes in group membership are enough disruption to induce a group level change in how the parakeets are structuring their fight patterns. All right, so let's start with dominance hierarchies first. So hierarchies have a long history of study, going back to what we think of as the foundational paper, which was published on peck orders in chickens in 1922. So this year is the 100-year anniversary of this foundational paper. And since the original paper, we've documented structured aggression and dominance hierarchies in groups across the animal kingdom. So this paper is great to go back to. I feel like Sheldrup Ebbe, who's the author of this paper, is almost like the Darwin of dominance hierarchies here. So it's filled with absolute gems. So for example, one of them is Anyone who thinks the inhabitants of a chicken yard are thoughtless, happy creatures with a daily life of undisturbed pleasure is thoroughly mistaken. A grave seriousness lies over the chicken yard. So it's just really fantastic, the kinds of insight that are put forward in this original paper. So if you're interested in a broad overview of dominance hierarchies and the history of the research, I just published a theme issue with Eli Strauss, James Curley, and Dai Shizuka, where all the papers in this issue really focus on kind of the cutting edge of what do we know about dominance hierarchies across many different systems. And looking across the history, this historical perspective for me was really striking. So for example, if we look at these word clouds, these come from a science of science approach that I used to look at historical use of words in titles in publications associated with dominance over all the decades in the history of the field. And looking across these decades of research shows that interest in hierarchies has been high and sustained for across the entire history. And the field appears to be becoming more interdisciplinary in recent decades. And the reason that I think hierarchies, aggression, and within group conflict are such a good model system for linking social and cognitive research together is because of these costs and benefits and the decision-making process that individuals use to choose their fights. So we can see this link really clearly in one of our common expressions. So I love this one. It's choose your battles wisely, right? So let's go through this. So choose, right? So this highlights that there is a decision between several choices. Your battles, right? Conflict is present and expected in the system. And the wisely part is that there's a cognitive component, right? Where some choices have better outcomes than others. So what we can do is ask questions like, in groups with dominance hierarchies, how much do individuals have to know about their rank in order to choose the fights in the ways that they're choosing them? So I wrote a paper a while ago, or recently, I guess this was recently. What is time these days anyway? So recently, this paper about digging into the social information underlying different kinds of aspects of dominance and rank. And but a big open question is, how do we figure out what animals know about their own rank and the rank of others in the group? So a big part of my research is to try to find plausible generating rules that are underlying social behaviors. So really carefully considering in each case the complexity of the rules, right? Because we don't want to overassume cognitive skills, but we also don't want to sell animals short, right? So the way that I've been doing this kind of research is to merge traditional approaches with these more computational methods. So I start with behavioral observations and captive experiments, but then merge those data collection and analyses with network analysis and computational modeling. And then for a more generalizable perspective, I zoom out to species comparison and these kind of generalized frameworks for understanding these social systems. And so what I'll show you today is, let's start with parrots first as a study system, and then I'll dive into the parakeets specifically. So the parrots are an incredibly frustrating species to study, but they're also very interesting. So I'd be happy to talk about the frustrating parts later. But the thing that I find really intriguing about the parrots is that they share many traits with socially and cognitively complex species, but they're not closely related to us, right? So they're a nice kind of example of the potential for the evolution of complex sociality and cognition to use as a comparison to what we see in humans and primates and other large-brained organisms. So for example, parrots have extended developmental times, long lifespans, large brain sizes. They use complex cognitive skills. They also have high fission-fusion dynamics. They're mostly socially monogamous, as far as we know for some species. And they have vocal learning pathways in their brains that are remarkably similar to the language learning pathways in human brains. So the monk parakeets, I was complaining about parrots before, the monk parakeets are one of the more tractable of the parrot species to do this kind of socio-cognitive research with. And so the parakeets are interesting beyond just the general parrot reasons because of a couple things. So they're native to temperate areas of South America, and they're notable for both their highly social nature and their success as an invasive species. So you can see here on the map, you can see from their yellow highlighted native range, they've been transported worldwide by the pet trade, and they've formed many feral populations around the world. So what I've done in my work is to work with wild populations in Argentina in the native range, as well as captive populations in Florida to form the foundation of what sociality looks like in these birds. So most of my detailed data on sociality and everything that I'll talk about today comes from these captive experiments. All right, so in captivity, our general methods revolve around observing and experimenting with groups of individuals in these large outdoor flight pens, which I'll show you in a second. So first, what we need to do is be able to recognize all the individuals. So what we do and how we accomplish that is with the highly technical method of drawing all over their faces with Sharpie markers. So here you can see each individual has a unique color combination on the head, the cheeks, and the neck. And this is a remarkably effective way of marking the birds, and we can easily refresh these marks as we need to. And the birds cannot destroy them. They're extremely destructive. So we also have no evidence that these marks are changing their behavior, which is good. So once we have them all marked, then what we do is take them and release groups into a large semi-natural outdoor flight pen and then observe them over time. So we observe the locations, the behaviors, and the interactions of the birds and collect all that data. So as an example of the kind of data that we collect, you can see here 3 different interaction types. So all of our social interaction data now in our more recent experiments is entered directly into electronic format using the Animal Observer app on iPads in real time, so that every night we can actually run the social structures and see in real time how they're establishing. So the kinds of data that we collect, for example, are nearest neighbor observations. So you can see an example there of 2 individuals that are close together. You can see an example of affiliation where one individual is allopreening the other individual. And you can see here an example of aggression. So fights in parakeets are very directional, and the decision to aggress against another individual almost guarantees that that individual is going to become the winner. So they're very directed and very, generally the outcomes are very clear. And they fight a ton, as you're going to see. So we can get a ton of data on how they're choosing their fights. So what I'll show you today is a blend of some of the previously published observational results. So these go back all the way back to data that I collected in 2008. And I'll blend that with brand new results that we have coming in from the field season last year, from the 2021 experimental manipulations of these parakeet systems. So here you can see the crew from the 2021 field season. The crew was led by my postdoc, Anna Marie van der Marel, and with support from my PhD students, Claire O'Connell, Xavier Francis, Chelsea Carmenito, and our postbac, Cesar Estienne, who's now a PhD student at Berkeley. Okay, so our major focus now is, with these new experiments, is what new insight can we gain from studying how rank and social dominance change when the system is perturbed? Because most of these old results are observational, right? We let the system, the birds come together, form their hierarchies, and then just observe it over time. But we're not going in and kicking the system and perturbing it. That's what we do in the 2021 field season. And that's what the crew is actually doing right now in the new field season that they're working on right now. So how do we get rank? Well, we rank all the individuals in these groups based on their fight outcomes. So I mentioned that they fight a lot. So in 2021, in about 4 or 5 months of fieldwork, the crew recorded over 27,000 fights. Oh my goodness. And what we do is we take all those fights where we know the identity of the winner, the identity of the loser, and then we can summarize all of that into a matrix of the wins. So here you can see that individual A, for example, won 12 times over individual B. And then we do a rank embedding process. So here we use a modified page rank approach. And for details on all these methods, I'll point you kind of generally towards the papers, and you can see all the citations at the bottom of the slides if you want more details, or I'd be happy to talk about them more later. But basically what we do is we take these rank embeddings and then we can figure out the rank of all the individuals. So here you can see 2 replicate social groups with their headshots arranged from the highest ranked individuals at the top to the lowest ranked individuals at the bottom. Now, some of these methods give us ordinal rankings, but a lot of them, including this rank embedding method with PageRank, is a continuous measure of rank. So we call that more like the power of the individuals. All right, so what do we know from previous results about monk hierarchy and how they structure their dominance hierarchies? So first, what we know is that hierarchies become very structured and they form quickly in novel groups. So within the first, 4 to 6 days, you can detect a structured hierarchy in groups that have never all interacted with each other before. The second thing that we found is that parakeets integrated their own experiences and observations to choose their fights. So this little plot here is showing you motifs in the system. So essentially these chains of interaction. So you deconstruct the whole network into who interacted with who, link them all together in one continuous chain, and then say, is their probability of interacting greater or less than, depending on the length of that chain. So this is all work that I collaborated on with Simon Dedeo. What we're finding is that to back up this indication that parakeets are integrating this information themselves in what we're thinking of as a very socio-cognitive process, is that rank is not correlated or was not correlated in these initial results with individual characteristics. So anything we can measure, and we measured a lot of things, right? Body size, body weight, beak length, wing length, all that kind of stuff, space use, call characteristics, none of those strongly predict which rank an individual can attain in these groups. So what we concluded from these early analyses is that rank is likely a social product in these groups. But there's a lingering question, right? And I get this every single time that I give a talk and go to conferences and try to publish papers on this, is what if rank is an outcome of a characteristic, but we just didn't measure the salient trait, right? What if we missed it? What if it's not something obvious like body size? So the first part of the talk here is going to dig into this deceptively simple question, right? At the individual level, is rank predicted by individual characteristics, or is it an emergent social property? And we're going to use these new perturbation experiments that we did last year to start to more conclusively test whether rank can be predicted by some kind of characteristic, even if we didn't measure the salient trait. All right, so here's what we do for these perturbation experiments. We do a targeted removal and replacement of the top ranked bird in the group at each point. So here's our timeline. So you can see here 3 perturbation experiments. And what we do is we allow the birds to interact and the hierarchies to stabilize. Then we identify the top ranked bird. We trap all the birds, but we remove that top ranked bird and put it into separated housing. And then we release the rest of the group back into the flight pen and allow the hierarchy to restabilize. Then what we do is 8 days later, we reintroduce that removed bird and we see how it reintegrates into the group. And so what we can do with this kind of approach is we can ask 2 questions here. And we can say first, if rank is due to some individual characteristic, even if we didn't measure it, right? The removed bird should be able to come in and retake its previous rank when it's returned to the social group that it previously dominated. Okay, we can also say, okay, what if it's something that we didn't measure or something obviously that we did measure, but that characteristic is changing on a time scale that matches our perturbations? So we can ask another question here that say, well, if individual characteristics like something like body size predicts rank, then the characteristics that would affect rank would change following the removal and prior to the reintroduction. So we can look at these two questions here. Let's start with the first. So can individuals retake their ranks when replaced in their groups? So here's removal 1. So this is blue, blue, blue here for trial 1. And you can see that blue, blue, blue here in the thick blue line. The dotted line indicates when it was absent from the group and then how it reintegrated into the group. And you can see that this bird went from being the top ranked individual in the group, which had been stable for 2 months prior, right? This was a very stable top ranked individual. We removed it for just 8 days, right? Threw it back in and it rejoined the hierarchy at the absolute bottom rank. Okay, let's look at another one. So if we go over to green, purple, green is our second trial. We removed it. It was the top ranked bird after blue, blue, blue suffered that giant fall from grace here. And we removed this bird. Again, it's coming back in when it's replaced in the group near the bottom of that hierarchy. It didn't fall quite as far as the first bird, but it is not coming in anywhere near close to its previous rank. Finally, for removal 3 here, we see a very similar pattern to the first removal, right? We take out the very top ranked bird here in orange, and we reintroduced it, and it came back in again at the very, very bottom of that hierarchy. So what we're seeing here is that this evidence is pointing towards the fact that social history seems to matter in monk parakeet rank. So none of the 3 removed birds were able to retake their previous rank immediately after reintroduction. So supporting that intrinsic characteristics of individuals are not responsible for rank. So we can also test, right? Maybe when we remove that bird, it got depressed, right? And dropped a lot of weight. And then when we put it back in, it couldn't compete at the same level that it was competing at before. And so what we can do is look for rapid changes in some characteristics. And the most obvious rapid change here would be body size, so body weight. So if individuals are dropping a lot of weight because they're stressed during the removal process, you might see that on reintroduction, the birds weigh a lot less than they do when they were removed from the group. We can then compare that to 8 days after their reintroduction. How much weight did they lose then, right? As kind of a benchmark for the whole process. Okay, so to test for this, what the crew did is go in and weigh all the birds, and then they tested for the change in body mass from the time at removal to prior to that, and the time of replacement or after replacement to when they got replaced. Okay, what we find in a nutshell is removals were not associated with consistent weight loss. So you can see the weight change here. So a positive number would be weight gain and a negative number is weight loss. And just to benchmark everything, this is the change in weight over time for the whole group. So it's really small here, but you can see that most individuals are not changing a whole lot from their baseline weight over time. And this kind of gives us a benchmark for looking at how much weight change is happening for our removed birds. So the weight at removal compared to just prior to reintroduction is popping up there. And this is the weight at reintroduction compared to 8 days post reintroduction. So what we're seeing is the weight of all the birds stayed relatively stable following their removals. So the removal phase does not seem to be a huge impact on the overall weight of the birds. So they're being reintroduced into the group at roughly the same weight as when they left it. In contrast, we see most of the weight change, at least for these 2 individuals, is happening after replacement. So after they're coming in back at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? They have that huge fall from grace. That seems to be potentially stressful for the birds, and they are losing weight. At least 2 out of 3 of the trials were losing weight during that time. Okay, so what all this is showing us at the individual level is that these new perturbation experiments are allowing us to go in and really kind of perturb the system and experimentally manipulate some of the conditions that would tell us a little bit more about the ranks of the individuals. So in combination with the past results, these are demonstrating that rank is more likely to be an emergent social property of these captive groups. So let's go over now to the group level. So now we can say, can changes in group membership induce a group level change in social dominance patterns? So here we use computational methods to infer what parakeets know about rank. And again, I want to point you towards the paper that I wrote with Simon Dedeo earlier on, and then some of the new work in collaboration with both Simon and Dan Munster, which I'll get to in a second. So we can take this process, right, of observing the fights, summarizing the fights, and then building these underlying aggression networks that contribute to the rank of the individuals. But what we can do now is map the rank information back onto the individual event level fights. And we can say, ask questions like, how is conflict structured by this rank information? So essentially, as a parakeet, do you need to know anything specific about where you're ranked in the hierarchy and the relative rank difference between you and all of your potential targets in order to choose the fights in the way that you do? All right, so essentially we can say, are the parakeets or any animal, are they just following the basic rules of a hierarchy, or is there additional structure to those aggression decisions? And so you can think of 3 potential social dominance patterns. So the first is just a basic dominance hierarchy, right? The downward heuristic, the rule is you just attack anybody ranked lower than yourself. You don't really care who those individuals are. So that would look like this. So if we've got the aggression network here with the top ranked individuals at the top and the low ranked individuals at the bottom, if we take this individual here, for example, then if it's following a downward heuristic, it should be spreading its aggression across all of these potential targets highlighted in the gray box here, anybody ranked below itself. Now, if it's using a more complex information-based strategy, they might be using a close competitor's social dominance pattern, which would have the individuals, this one highlighted in yellow here, would maybe focus its aggression on attacking individuals that are ranked only slightly below itself. So then it has to differentiate between individuals, not just everybody ranked below itself, but who's slightly below and potentially a challenger to its own rank. All right. The third social dominance pattern is bullying, where the aggression is focused on individuals that are at the very bottom of the hierarchy, at the furthest ranked difference from yourself in your position in the hierarchy. And the way computationally that we can come in and kind of differentiate between these social dominance patterns is using some reference models. Oh, let's see. Stopped advancing. Go. There we go. Use reference models for these network analyses. And this is work in collaboration with a lot of really fun collaborators, including Noah Pinto-Wollman. And so what we do with these reference models is that we can go in and we can break part of the observed structure. And then we say, does the network structure that we preserved with the slightly broken rules, does that structure diverge from what we see observationally in the real world? So what we do in this case is observe the rank and the fight patterns, where in the real world, the structural rules are unknown. And then we can simulate the rank and fight patterns if parakeets are only, or any species, is only obeying the direction of the hierarchy. So essentially, we're forcing the aggression network to comply with this downward heuristic social dominance pattern. And then we can compare the two and say, do we still have a reasonable match between the two, or are they diverging to the point where the downward heuristic is not a plausible generating function for the real patterns that we're seeing? So what we do to do that is randomly rewire the aggression network. So I'm just going to give you a taste of these methods here, but I'm going to send you to the paper that we published on these methods last year for the full explanation. So if we take a simplified network, right, and we, instead of edge strengths between all the individuals, we have just each arrow is an event, and it's between each individual in the group is a node in this mini network. So the numbers show you the ranks. So 1 is the top ranked individual here, 5 is the bottom ranked individual. So what we'd go in and do is to find one of those edges, look at the one labeled in red here. We disconnect it from its actual target that we observed in the real world, and we reconnect it to somebody else. So here, because we're simulating the downward heuristic, attack anybody ranked lower than yourself, then because we're disconnecting the aggression that's perpetuated by that top ranked individual, we can reconnect that edge to anybody else in the group because they're all lower ranked than that one individual. So let's say we reconnect it to 3 then. So we'd go through and we do this over and over and over again and rewire the whole network so that all of the fight decisions then are compliant with just this basic rule of the hierarchy: attack anybody ranked lower than yourself. What these methods do is they preserve a lot of the structure of the real data sets. So they preserve the total number of individuals in the group, the total number of contests that each individual won. So each individual's, you can think of this as their intrinsic aggressive level. And within some wiggle, each individual's ordinal rank in the hierarchy. What it breaks, though, is which lower ranked individual was beaten in which contest. So again, as I said, this reproduces the aggression consistent with a downward heuristic. And then we can compare and we can say if the real structures diverge too strongly from that general rule, then they fall under either this close competitors or these bullying patterns. What we see if we look across 85 different species and 172 independent social groups is that all 3 social dominance patterns are cropping up in groups across taxa, right? Across the phylogenetic range in the data set here. And you can see the species and the groups grouped by order here. You can see their little icons there on the left to indicate the order. And so what we find is that 77% of these groups, the majority, are using a basic downward heuristic rule. They're just following the rules of a hierarchy. Attack anybody ranked lower than yourself. But 22% of the groups are using what we think of as these more complex information-based strategies. So 13% are using close competitors, bullying, social dominance patterns, and 9% are bullying individuals in their groups. We can dig into this even more because we have several species for which we had multiple independent social groups that were sampled. And when we look at all of the groups, here we had 37 different species where we had multiple social groups that were sampled. Groups within species also are often showing different social dominance patterns. So for example, here we've got 17 different species, so 46% of the total that had multiple social groups have these multiple social dominance patterns. And 3 species, which are highlighted here, actually showed we had groups where we could detect all 3 of the social dominance patterns. So this is indicating here, and what we came away from with these analyses is that you have to be really careful about thinking about these social dominance patterns as indicative or characteristic of the species, right? We think potentially there's a lot more plasticity involved in which social dominance pattern emerges in groups, and that groups might be sensitive to environmental and social conditions that would cause different social dominance patterns to be beneficial in different conditions, potentially. But why do groups have different patterns within species? And can a single group change its dominance pattern? Or is it just an outcome of the conditions, the long-term conditions that the group is held in or subject to? So if we go back over to the parakeet example, what we can do is reinterpret some of the older results and find that social groups can change which strategy or which social dominance pattern they're using over time. So here you can see 2 replicate groups of the parakeets. And initially, what you have to pay attention to here is just this type of social dominance pattern that they're using. So in group 1, they were initially using a downward heuristic in the first 6 days of interacting in these novel groups. Group 2 was using a bullying pattern, right? But once the social structure had formed and stabilized and they got over that first kind of 6-day window where this was happening, what happened when rank was stable was that both groups converged onto a close competitor's social dominance pattern. So they switched. So observationally, we can say that this shift can change, but what we wanted to do experimentally is go in and say, can we force it to change, right? Can we go in and kick the system essentially and induce this change in the social dominance pattern by perturbing the group membership? So essentially we're perturbing just a little part of the social system and seeing how the group responds. So we're going to use the same perturbation experiment structure with the same 3 perturbations from the 2021 field season. So you can see here the yellow arrows indicate when the birds were removed and the green arrows indicate when that bird was reintroduced into the group. And we can look at the social dominance pattern at the group level at each of these assessment points. So gray points will be indicative that the group had a downward heuristic, this basic rule of the hierarchy. Red is a close competitors pattern, and blue will be the bullying. So we can map on here and see how the social dominance patterns are changing, potentially in response to these perturbations. And so what we see is after removals, the dominance pattern is remaining stable. So you can see here, here, and here, our social dominance pattern just prior to removal and just following removal is staying the same. Okay, but we can also look at these reintroductions. And after the reintroduction, something different happens. The social dominance pattern changes to bullying in all 3 of our trials. So you can see here, prior to reintroduction, all 3 groups, all 3 instances had a downward heuristic, and that immediately changed over to a bullying pattern. And we can look at how that, that change happened at the network level. So if we look at an example of aggression network change, this is from trial 1, where the individual started at the very top rank and came back in and was reintroduced and reintegrated in the group at the very, very bottom of the rank. What we see is a lot of similarity at the structural level. So these hierarchies are not completely crumbling when we're doing this minor perturbation to the group structure. So a new individual is emerging as the top ranked individual. And you can see here highlighted in orange with the dotted line is the formerly top ranked bird prior to removal, and then coming in following removal at the very bottom of the hierarchy. What you can see here is the density of these aggression networks stayed very similar. Lots of the structural features of the dominance hierarchies are preserved. And you see about the same breakdown in terms of the rule followers, which are blue edges in these networks. So this is anytime a top ranked or a high ranked bird fought and won against a lower ranked bird. And the same roughly percentage of rule breakers, right? Anytime that a lower ranked individual fought and won against a higher ranked individual. And if the structure of these networks is crumbling, right, we would expect a decrease in the linearity and the detectability of these hierarchies, but we'd also expect an increase in the rule breakers, right, as the hierarchy becomes more unstable and less structured. But we're not seeing that. We're seeing a lot of similarities. And so what happens is the reintroduced bird is getting the bulk of the aggression directed straight towards it. And this is causing that bullying pattern to be detectable at the group level, is this just outpouring of aggression towards this poor guy. All right, so what we're finding at the group level then is that perturbing one top-ranked bird can trigger a shift in the social dominance pattern, but only after the replacement of the formerly top-ranked bird, not on its removal. And we're also finding that other aspects of that dominance hierarchy structure are preserved, are resilient to these perturbations. So the entire thing is not crumbling. So building on these results, what we're starting to look at in this reintroduction phase is that we're starting to suspect that heterogeneity in social support may be critical to explaining these rank changes. So here you can see some examples of this affiliative behavior between these strong partnerships. What we know from previous results is that affiliative relationships can form quickly, and they form the foundation of the monk-parakeet societies. And so affiliative relationships can stabilize more quickly and more robustly than neutral or aggressive relationships. And the parakeets seem really driven to establish these primary partnerships with one or two associates. This emerges really quickly in these novel groups. We can even see indications of this among complete strangers. So parallel to some of the work that Jerry Carter has been doing on vampire bats and forming these novel social relationships between strangers, what we've been doing is similar things in the parakeets. So this is some work that my PhD student Claire O'Connell is working on now. And what we've got are birds from here, the 4 different colors are 4 different subsites where new feral birds were captured. And then the edges indicates who's allopreening who. So you can see in week 1, even in week 1, so with barely into the introduction of these total strangers, you can see that there's a lot of interactions between individuals from the same capture site, but there's already interactions among individuals at different capture sites. So these novel parakeet relationships can form and change really quickly between strangers. And actually, I was just talking with Jerry about this, and this is orders of magnitude faster than novel vampire bat relationships can start to form. So it gives us some really nice possibilities for experimenting with these groups. And one thing that I want to show you about social support is that we're starting to see that, or we're starting to suspect that stable social support may buffer against these rank changes that we're seeing. So I'm going to give you 2 examples from our trials from last year. So for trial 1 and 3, what happened is in trial 1, that individual had a strong partnership with one other individual, but when we removed it, its remaining partner repaired with somebody else. We reintroduced that bird, and that previous partner was not having any of it and did not go back to being paired with that removed bird. And so that was a complete loss of that bird's primary social support. We saw a similar thing with the 3rd trial, where we had strong partnerships that reformed with another remaining pair member. And when we reintroduced the bird, its social support had evaporated. So both of those birds went from being absolute top ranked in the group to absolute bottom ranked when we reintroduced them. The interesting part is trial 2 here, where this bird was part of a strong trio. And when we removed the bird, the remaining members of that trio still stayed together. And so when we reintroduced the bird, it just rejoined the trio. So there was no loss of the existing social support. And we're starting to suspect that that may explain why this bird didn't have quite as an extreme reaction and come in quite as low ranked as the other 2 individuals. This is something that we're experimenting with just this season to follow up and get more replicates to better understand the patterns here. So what we're doing with the new parakeet perturbation experiments, which are happening right now, super exciting, is you can see a picture of the 2022 field crew on the left there. We've got 2 replicate groups that we're running simultaneously this season, and they're slightly smaller groups. So we've got about 10 individuals in each of the groups. What we're doing this season is looking at questions like, how does the group respond to the removal of middle or low ranked birds compared to what we're seeing from removal of the high ranked birds? We're also looking at how the group responds to the introduction of a stranger, right? Because possibly removing an individual from the group and reintroducing it 8 days later, I would say it's very unlikely, but it's possible that the group just forgot who that individual was. We have some playback experiments to back up the fact that they remember that individual, but we do need to compare it to the response to a complete stranger. So does a stranger have to join this group at the very bottom and kind of claw its way up in rank, or does it join at a different point in the hierarchy? We're also looking at how consistent these group level responses are, especially with more replication across these treatments. So all of these experiments are geared towards building new insight into parakeet sociality. So across the projects in the lab that are focused on the parakeets, we've got some people working on regime change, on social support, real-time social decision-making, the effect of these perturbations on social stress, and also vocal complexity and sociality in the birds, and recognition and response patterns, to really build up a comprehensive idea of the sociocognitive building blocks of parakeet society. And all of this work is, really focused on the parakeets, but really with an eye towards how we can use the same kinds of tools and similar insight to generalize across lots of different species. So my group has also been looking across species to better understand these links between sociality and cognition more generally, outside of just the parakeets. So I want to highlight a couple of those, and this would be fun to talk more about in the question period. But my student Sanjay Prasher has just started a series of new lab-based experiments where we're looking at bobwhite quail groups, and we're perturbing the groups as a whole. So rather than taking out one individual, we're separating the entire group. And we're looking at whether memory affects the formation of relationships, network structures, and dominance hierarchies in this species. And then leaving conflict altogether, I've also gone over to the cooperative side. And I have a project with Jerry Carter where we're working with his fascinating data set and new experiments on the vampire bats to look at how cooperation emerges from interactions at different social scales. So he's doing a series of social perturbation experiments which force new relationships to start within these small social groups. And then finally, I'm also experimenting with using sociality and animal behavior as kind of like a hook to train undergrads in computational biology and the basics of data science. So I want to talk a little bit about one of those projects at the end here. So one thing that we're building up now, we almost have a working prototype, which is super exciting, is this thing I'm calling the sociality game. So this is a way to build undergrad data skills through virtual, interactive, social experiments, right? So each student then joins a browser, right, with this artificial world, and they join it with a little avatar. Here they're penguins, right? We tell all the students the social rules, and then they follow those rules to move around the environment. So essentially, the students are developing model thinking skills by building and following these rule sets, and then constructing analyses to recover known patterns that they themselves created. So what we do is have them follow a rule like, this social asocial experiment that I'm showing here. So we tell all of the students that they're asocial penguins. You want to move around, you want to find food, you do not want to get near anybody else. You want to avoid them at all costs. But we secretly go in and tell just a couple of students that they're social, right? And their rule is that they want to be close to other penguins. And so in the virtual world, with all these avatars running around, get some really nice chasing dynamics that emerge. And in the background of this program, we collect all of the XY locations of all the individual avatars. And then we export it at the end. And the students can then analyze their own data and figure out who was the social penguin. How do you determine that? And if you know that one was social, one or more, and you figure out how to detect it when you know the pattern is there, then what the students can do is apply that same analysis to existing real world data and say, can we now look at actual penguin data and detect who's social and who's not social? So this is a nice example of, a very simple looking social rule, but really introduces students to, the kind of logic that underlies a lot of the agent-based modeling that is really important in understanding some of these social systems. And it also allows them to get out of kind of correlation frameworks and into more thinking about the causative rules underlying social systems, because the social system is built based on these rule sets. And so knowing that those are there helps them then think about real systems and try to match what they're seeing in these artificial systems to the patterns in real systems. All right. If you're intrigued by this approach, we will hopefully be beta testing soon. So I'd be really excited to have anybody who wants to go in and help us beta test. And I'll put the link to this in the chat in the question period. All right. So what I've showed you today is a whole bunch of stuff. So I showed you evidence that rank is most likely an emergent social property in these parakeet groups. So remember, I showed you that none of the removed birds were able to immediately retake their previous rank, and rank was not associated with either static or dynamic characteristics or the change in those characteristics. I also showed you that removing one bird and reintroducing it is sufficient to shift the group level social dominance pattern. So groups switched from a bullying pattern after every reintroduction, while the basic dominance hierarchy structures were largely retained in these groups. I also showed you some very preliminary results that indicate that social support in the system might be critical to understanding these patterns of rank change and potentially the buffering against rank loss. So reintroduced birds who rejoined previous relationships did not suffer as extreme a drop in rank. Again, here we only have those 3 trials and only one that had the existing social relationship. So this is something that we're following up with future interactions or future experiments. And then finally, I showed you how using networks as a kind of a common language can help unite these across multiple different subfields, how they can start to unite sociality and cognitive research, and how they can provide new insight into the links between the two, and also be used to train the future generation of biologists. So with that, I'd like to thank all of the institutions that have supported and funded this work. And I would be very happy to take lots and lots of questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thanks so much. Everyone is clapping, if you hear it or not. And yeah, so normally what we do now is just let folks raise their hands. So first the clapping hands will have to come down. And then if anyone has any questions for you, they can raise their hands. If you have your chat or list of participants visible, you can see who has raised their hand, and you can just field questions as they come in.
Sounds good. Yeah. So sorry, I can't talk anymore. Alexander, sorry, got it.
Yeah, no problem. Alex is fine. Yeah, really interesting talk. The one question that just came to me like at the very end of your talk is, this finding that social rank was dropping dramatically after reintroductions of the dominant parakeet. Do you have, I know you talked about future research on this, but do you have any data yet, or do you have like thoughts about if this is something that you think happens just because it's the top ranked bird after reintroduction, or do you think it could happen to any of the birds that are taken and reintroduced, that this is something that just happens generally?
Yeah. So that's a good question. And that's definitely something that we're focusing on during this new data collection right now, this field season. So just last week, they did the first perturbation of the middle ranked bird, right? And we're just now analyzing the data to see what happened with that. But yeah, it's critical to say, is this a function of just something that happens with the top ranked birds? Or does this happen really generally across any bird that's removed and then replaced? So we are looking at all 3 this season, the top ranked birds, the middle ranked birds, and the bottom ranked birds, to see if we can kind of see similarities in these patterns, or if there's something unusual about the top ranked bird coming out. Yeah, I'm really excited to see what happens.
I wonder, do you have any like sort of thoughts about what do you think would happen? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I mean, if the top ranked bird is really important in the social structure, right, and really critical to kind of structuring the overall aggression, then I would expect that bird would have more of an effect on the changes in the social system. And so I would expect that you're going to see the most changes with that top ranked bird. But that's an open question still, is what happens with those middle and bottom ranked birds. Yeah. I see another question from Kaya, maybe?
Hi, yes. I was wondering about the time period of the removals. It looks like for each of the removals, you kept the bird isolated for about the same amount of time. And I was wondering how you chose that length of time, and also whether you think that varying the length of time could help illuminate some of the underlying factors that are driving these dynamics based on, which factors might be operating at different time scales.
Yeah, good question. So we chose the time because we needed a long enough time for the social system to come back to a relatively stable state. So for a new individual to emerge as the top ranked bird and for everybody to kind of figure out their ranks. And so the 8-day period was based on previous results where a stable social dominance hierarchy could form in a completely novel group in 6 days flat. So we figured 8 days, then we're definitely going to be able to sample 3 days during kind of this unstable period where they're figuring stuff out right after the removal, and then 3 days where it should be more stable and would be right prior to a reintroduction or another removal. So some of that was logistics too, because catching the birds is relatively stressful for them. So we have experimented and we did a couple tests last season to see if we could shorten that removal period. But if you shorten it, then the birds are stressed just so much more and so much more frequently that we were seeing some negative effects on the parakeets themselves. So this kind of 8-day, 16-day total removal period is a good compromise between letting the social system recover and also not overly stressing the birds. But yeah, that is an interesting idea. And if we can find a way to do the removals with like lower stress on the birds, it would be really interesting to try to increase the speed at which you're doing the removals, because you could push the system to the point where, maybe you do 3 removals and it can recover really quickly each time, but then you stress it to a point where it just crumbles. So we could look at the robustness of the social system to repeated perturbations if we're varying the time of those perturbations.
We've got another hand up.
Daniel, I think you were next.
Susan, why don't you go ahead? I'll wait.
Okay, Susan.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I need to turn I'm in the field of my internet's a little bit shaky. So I had a couple questions actually. One was just amusing about these animals that go to the bottom when they're returned. In primates, I often see that too. And in that case, I've generally assumed that it's because in capuchins anyway, when a male leaves for a while and comes back, he's often been a bit treacherous, going off to visit the enemies and flirting with them. And they get really mad when they come back sometimes. I mean, they're very excited, but very nervous and often pick on them a lot when there's a lot of sex and reconciliation and stuff. But would that be a feature of monk parakeet society too? Or why do you think that they're bullying when they come back?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, at the most kind of cognitively complicated explanation probably is something like punishment, right? That you've deserted the group. And so we're going to be very aggressive when you start coming back in. So that potentially could explain it. It's a little bit hard to really nail that down with the parakeet. So we'll have to do a couple different experiments to really be able to say that, right? But I think, another thing that the group might be doing is if the new individuals that have achieved that higher rank in the absence of the previously top ranked individual are trying to hang on to their newly achieved ranks, you might see this general outpouring of aggression against this previously top ranked individual to force it to not reclaim its rank. So it might be a response at the group level to kind of individuals just trying to hang on to their own ranks and prevent that individual from clawing their way back to the top. Yeah, both of those potentially could be going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were interesting observations of Cayo Santiago that were quite different from what I see in the capuchins too. In that case, they have, with the really large groups in the artificial feeding situation, they have this seniority rule. And
Yeah.
then if a male leaves for a while, he does fall all the way to the bottom.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
in that case, they're not particularly useful. It's not like they're it's the females rather than males who are doing the intergroup aggression. And I think they generally, for the large groups, not so much the small ones in the wild, they thought there was cognitive constraints to remembering who goes where. So that was sort of a weird case. And I think it's quite different from what I see in the Capuchins.
Hmm.
I have another question, but I think I'll let other people go first. I have some methods questions for you too about
cool.
measuring dominance, which is, as you know, a very sticky topic. And
Oh
different
yeah,
countries are
definitely.
different. So since you've done a bunch of different taxes, I'd really like to hear your opinion about that too.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, like you said, maybe we can go to a couple more and then definitely circle back to these kinds of questions. Daniel, did you want to go now?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting material. Thank you. And I also want to say how much I appreciate your clear support for your junior colleagues and your students. It's really, really wonderful to see the way that you're foregrounding them. So a couple of points. One is kind of a straight natural history question that I'm just curious about and don't know the answer to, but the other is maybe a little more theoretically challenging, if you will. So the natural history question is, I mean, you pointed out that it seems that these affiliations are really important. Presumably they have enormous fitness consequences if they have such importance for rank, that they form them very quickly, right? Which is surprising that if these relationships are really important, that they're established so rapidly, right? And that they seem to potentially, at least some of them, lose them. So the triad that you mentioned, they reaccepted their member, but if partner formation is relatively quick in general, then they'll, in the other two experiments, basically, the bereaved got over it quickly, right? As it were, right? they moved on, right? And so when the alpha returned, he was out of luck, right? So
Yes.
I'm curious this is surprising if the animals have the cognitive capacities to keep identities in mind and recognize partners, which presumably they do. So I'm curious what the ecological features are that basically that you write somebody off so quickly, right? Whether there's high mortality or whether there's frequent intergroup exchange. Why not keep waiting, as it were, right, for your partner to come back?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, so going over to what we know about the natural history in the wild. So in the native range, the parakeets nest colonially and also communally in these giant nest structures that they can build pretty much everywhere. So eucalyptus trees, telephone poles, windmills, they're very good at utilizing lots of different structures to build their nests. And because they can build their own nests, they have a lot more control about their colonial structures than a lot of birds that are reliant on something like a naturally occurring cavity in the nests and might be nest site limited, right? So the monk parakeets can go and build their nests pretty much anywhere. And they use these nests year round. And so they breed in them in the breeding season, but then over the winter, they come back and they roost in the nests every night because it does get cold in temperate Argentina and Uruguay. And so at night they take shelter in these nests. So they really seem to be very tied to these colonial aggregations. So they're not a species that migrates seasonally, and they don't also seem to be a species that frequently spends at least the nights somewhere else, right? They're coming back to these colonies really consistently. And so in that case, what might be happening is this 8-day removal period that we're doing is enough to signify to a remaining partner that that bird is dead and gone, and you better repair real quick if you want to have the benefits of having a partner in this social system. So they do have fission-fusion social structures. So the groups will change in composition and size very frequently through the days. And the colonies of the parakeets in the native range are not that far apart, and there are a million of them. So in the native range, they actually call them La Plaga, the plague, right? There are so many of them everywhere. And so it is possible in the native range that you do see fluctuations and shifting between where the parakeets are going. A small subset of the birds in the native range seem to be kind of transient or floaters. So it wouldn't be totally out of the question to have a parakeet disappear for a couple of days and then come back. But yeah, it is really striking that that 8-day period, I mean, some of these pairs can reform on really short time scales. So on the scale of a day or two, we see a new strong partnership emerging. So there does seem to be some kind of drive to have a strong partnership in these groups. So we don't really know what the benefit of that is yet. But we're looking into this connection with the social system to see if maybe the rank buffering might be one of those benefits.
Yeah, so just briefly, and then the more conceptual question, that suggests that if, I don't know how invasive your measures are with the captive animals, but you might expect that relative to species with more stable structures, right, that you see stress response to partner absence attenuate very quickly, right? So essentially and I'm intentionally using the word bereavement because I think it's a reasonable, at least an analogy and possibly a homology, right? That their bereavement is quite truncated, and that there may be closely related species that have different social patterns in which you see a very different pattern.
Yeah, and we're actually collecting data specifically about the stress response this field season. So my student, Chelsea Carmenito, she's put up a series of GoPro cameras at the top of these flight pens, and then we're filming the birds right after a removal event compared to just a normal day to see if we see more of these kind of stress-related behaviors. So more kind of aimless wandering or searching, or kind of these, they kind of move in, they almost have like more twitchier kind of movement patterns, it seems like, when they get stressed out. So we're going to be comparing at the group level to see how long the group kind of recovers from these stressful events, but also we can differentiate between the removed bird's partner compared to everybody else in the group, and see if those stress responses, how long that takes to kind of stable off and go back to normal behavior.
Cool. Well, I know that Claudia has a question too, so I'll be brief. But I want to push you a little bit on the dichotomy that you've posed between rank being an emergent property or property of the individual, right? If these social relationships are so important, right? And the dissolution of a social relationship is social death in a lot of ways, right? Then it would be very surprising if individuals are pairing at random, right? If there aren't any criteria for partner choice, right? And if there are criteria for partner choice, then rank isn't purely an emergent property. Rank isn't a consequence of an individual, right? If there's homophily with regard to any of a wide variety of dimensions that lead to social success, right? So it is emergent in the sense that within the confines of your of the information that you're presenting us, it looks emergent, but they're probably underlying individual properties that properties of individuals that in fact are determinative.
Yeah, it could be. And actually, my student Claire is looking at the social relationship formation patterns now. So we should have more information about just how those partners get chosen, and what kinds of things affect that partner choice formation, especially for the remaining partners of those removed birds. So how quickly does that happen, and who are they scoping out, right? So a lot of times when these new partnerships form, what happens is that if a new partnership forms with that removed bird's remaining partner, that requires the dissolution of other relationships in the group. So you get like kind of some social upheaval, and there's a lot of drama that occurs until those partnerships get sorted out again. And so she's going to be focusing specifically on all of that social drama to see if we can predict, how the relationships are forming. But what I think is that if rank is really, linked to the social support, right, then the rank is kind of, it's a two-factor kind of process, right? So it's not a complete deterministic process of the individual itself, but a secondary outcome of its partner choices, potentially. So yeah, we should know more soon about all of kind of fleshing out that more affiliative side of the whole equation.
Very cool. Thank you.
Thanks. Twali?
Yeah, that's Claoli. Thank you for your very interesting talk. My question is actually a little bit methodological, and it's actually about that study that you did with all of those 185 species, I think. So I think it's impressive. I was wondering though whether with this great variety of taxa that you included, do your computations of relative rank consider that some of these species might actually, because I understand that these computations are based on interactions, right? Observing interactions. So could it happen that some of these species do not actually have such transitive or decisive relationships? How are these differences in potentially rate of aggression dealt with this computation? I can imagine that some of these species are definitely not interacting as frequently as your parakeets. So what are the timeframes that you use to compute those relative ranks?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it really varies widely, right? These are historical data sets that were captured on aggression and with the goal of publishing a dominance hierarchy paper, right? So those are all of the, there's some bias then in terms of the groups that are have dominance hierarchy papers published about them, right? And that's where we're getting all the data are from papers that were published about hierarchies. So definitely if you're looking across lots of different species, you see a lot of species that do not have clear hierarchies, right? So you have to take that into account. So this analysis was really geared towards species that do have hierarchies, right? Detectable structures, and then just saying, can we dig below the surface and find extra patterns that are hidden in there, despite or in addition to those basic rules of a hierarchy? So you're totally right that across these species, I mean, there are like massive differences in the time spans of these studies. There are some species that the groups were in captivity or in the wild. There's wild differences in the number of individuals in these groups, and also the number and kind of frequency of the aggressive events. So as with any kind of, big meta-analysis, you do have to kind of take a couple steps back and kind of generalize. So the way that we went in is to go in and just say, okay, we're going to take all of these data as reported, right? And as this first pass, we're going to say all of these systems were reported by the original researchers as reasonable timeframes for their particular study species to detect these hierarchies. And generally people are trying to, with the historical data, just detect the structure of the hierarchy. And usually they're choosing a period of time over which they can get a reasonable amount of data and where the overall structure of the hierarchy is stable. They're not trying to summarize over times when the hierarchy is likely to be changing quite a bit. So we did make a lot of simplifying assumptions in the methodology of that, but taking a step back and just saying, okay, well, we're going to apply this consistent method to each of the groups. What we did is each individual group gets its own custom-built agent-based model to re-simulate the aggression structure as if they were just following the rules of the hierarchy, right? And so by modeling it at the level of each particular social group, we keep a lot of the actual structure of the groups. So we're not forcing the group to conform to, a parakeet system or an ant system or a primate system or something like that. We're kind of taking the group as it is and just breaking that one rule of breaking who they're targeting and seeing if that then causes a divergence in the structure. So I think using that kind of modeling perspective where you're really keeping a lot of things built in that are consistent with the actual observed data can be one way of kind of dealing with a lot of the variability in some of these data sets. Cool. Susan, do you want to go back to your methodological question?
Yes, I wish I had thought about this a little more right before your talk, because this is an issue that I waste about a couple of weeks of time on every year, just beating my head against the wall. So I work on capuchins, and I have this 32-year study. And capuchins, unlike your marvelous parakeets that fight constantly and apparently have relatively unidirectional outcomes, they fight a lot, but they have a lot of back talk and there's no clear winner. They just bicker and don't have, a really despotic hierarchy. However, they do have a clear subordination hierarchy. So if you just look at the rate of spontaneous cowering and avoiding, they do have a linear hierarchy. However, those events are very rare because they generally arrange themselves so they don't have to look submissive. And so this is an absolute nightmare for us. It seems like the current trend is to use ELO ratings, but what happens is, if I know the actual matrices for multi-year periods, what happens is the animals that are not such big bullies end up lower than, or the ones who are bullies end up on top of the ones who are actually dominant to them if you just look at the actual matrix. And this drives me crazy. I mean, I know ELO ratings are great for changing over a rapid time span. And the other thing, if you've got really rare observations, what do you do when there's an occasional human error where somebody flips the direction in their data and you don't want to assume, oh, rank reversal. And then, so, we usually try to find two in the same direction before we assume this is real. So have you thought about how to address these issues and where the methodology, maybe makes total sense for a unidirectional, frequently aggressive species. But when you have these interactions that for far and few between, you really need to use a longer time scale for making a change, assuming a true change.
Yeah. So there are a couple parts. So I'm gonna tackle the ELO part first, and then if I forget any parts, definitely remind me. But the ELO rating that you're mentioning, is originally developed for rating chess players, right? So it's really geared towards this tournament level kind of structure where you've got two individuals or two teams or something going against each other, and then you have an outcome, and then they go against somebody else. And so the thing that bothers me about the ELO ratings is you don't get a whole lot of the network level perspective into there because it's really geared towards this like tournament level structure. And so one thing it's not good at integrating is fights that don't occur, right? So you could have fights that don't occur because the individuals just don't happen to get close enough to fight. But you could also have fights that occur, where those zeros are informative, right? And those individuals are avoiding each other. And ELO rating doesn't do a good job at integrating kind of those levels of decision making. It also doesn't do a good job of observational information, right? So in ELO rating, there's no way to integrate what just happened in a fight and how those individuals may be specifically targeting specific opponents in the next fight contingent on, their information about how fights just happened in their group. And so it is really good at looking at kind of like point by point how rank is changing, but it's particularly effective for this tournament level style approach where individual experience is really important in how rank is perceived by the individual in the group and also by the group itself. So a lot of these network level measures that I've been using are nice because they get away from that like tournament level kind of perspective. And so like this modified version of PageRank that I've been using quite a bit and that I developed in collaboration with Simon Tadeo and Dan Munster, it really takes the whole network into account. And so if you're avoiding individuals, that gets taken into account. If you're being aggressed at by a particular individual, and then that individual aggresses against somebody else who aggresses against somebody else, all of that momentum for the aggression kind of percolates through the network. And so it can be a better model for systems where rank is dependent on the networks and on both experience and observation. So that might be something to look into. It might help with that the ELO rating problem of like fight by fight kind of outcomes.
Yeah, that sounds great. And is this open source software that you
so
developed?
Dan put together an R package. So it's called DOMstruck. So you can find it in the PNAS paper. We have a link to the package. And I can also put a link in the chat if I'm fast enough. But it's available and you can download it from his GitHub page.
So no, that's great. And it just ELO ratings have taken primatology by storm, and I object strenuously, but I'm really outnumbered. So you've given me even more reasons to fight
Okay.
back.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it works well, right? But like
Yeah,
in other
sometimes it
cases,
never
it's
does
really
for me,
missing,
though.
like, yeah, some of the information that's really important in the system. Actually, one other thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about the ELO rating and the mistakes, right? So one of the things that I think about a lot, and especially coming from like a complex systems kind of background, this is some work that Jessica Flack has been doing and thinking about a lot at the Santa Fe Institute, is the connection between event by event outcomes and how that affects the social property at the group level. So essentially, if one rank reversal, one event happens in the opposite direction, right? A low ranked individual happens to get a lucky shot and win against a high ranked individual. Does that change how that individual thinks about its own rank immediately and the way that the group perceives that individual? Or does it have to do that consistently over a certain amount of time before you get that flip in how the group is interacting with that individual? So I think the nice thing about thinking at the group social property, in addition to those event by event social properties, is that you can get this lag between what is happening on an event by event basis and how that's affecting these more emergent social properties. And so a system that's pretty resilient, right, shouldn't be so fragile that one reversal like causes the whole thing to crumble, right? Ideally, it's probably got more momentum behind it than that. But that would be something to definitely look at, is that lag between rare events happening and things at the other level. And I think your idea of saying, okay, well, as researchers, we have to see it twice just to, make sure that that was real, is a good way to kind of rule out some of those events that might have been mistakes on the data collection side. But I think there might also be mistakes on the animal side, right? It's like, oh gosh, right, that was a bad idea. I take it all back, right? Like that might happen on for the animals themselves. So that's something that I think is tricky to integrate into the current methods.
Well, and also, I mean, you never have, at least in capuchins, the whole group together. So even if this really happened, the group's not going to know about it. A couple other monkeys may know about it, but the whole group certainly is. And
exactly. Yeah. And so if that observation is important, right, you should see that individual that just won that rare fight should wait until the rest of the group members or more group members are around and then target that individual again. So you might essentially see it less as winning a fight and more as signaling, right? It's like, now I can beat that guy. Look, I did it again. Look, I did it again. Now you saw it, right? So pay attention to that. So you might be able to see those kind of like rule breaking events and look at the group compositions and see when those are happening. And it's almost, in that case, it might almost be more analogous to an individual teaching the group that it should be perceived as having a new rank now, rather than just kind of repeatedly beating that individual, because it gets more of a benefit potentially from the signaling than actually the aggression itself.
Or you might expect that they'll want to try it out without an audience, and then if they try it with an audience.
Exactly. Yeah. If I'm not sure, I might take a lucky shot when nobody else is around and just see what happens. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think incorporating the observers into all of this is going to be a really interesting next step to understanding all of the hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, thank you. It's really cool stuff you're doing.
Thank you.
Okay, so I just wanted to announce it's 1:30, and so we're now crossing into the bonus round. If anyone is here, for whatever reason, and they'd like to sit and chat more with Liz, welcome. I plan on kicking things off with a question of my own, but if you have to go as your normal schedule dictates, thank you for being here. And of course, thank you, Liz, for bringing us all together and having this moment with your work, which is so fascinating.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, it's great to learn more about your research. And so let's just linger here as the group sort of re-aggregates and reestablishes itself, and we can just play it by ear, see how that goes. I actually did have a question for you, because some of the basic objectives of the work that you're doing has so much value across any taxa, really, including people, of course. So like there's an issue, for example, in hunter-gatherer studies that arises when trying to quantify social organization. It's a really basic issue. So it boils down to, for example, if you wanted to survey 10 hunter-gatherer societies and quantify the size of social groups, for example, within a hunter-gatherer society, you're likely to see all these different variable-sized residential groups. Some will be quite small, some will be quite large, and the ways that researchers have approached reporting that information, there's basically two fundamental ways to do it. One is to say, okay, here's the raw counts of the sizes of different hunter-gatherer groups. And then there's another way of expressing the same data, which is to say, let's look at it from the perspective of each individual. And so that's called in the forager literature, the experienced group size, which is saying, okay, so you have one big massive group that has 100 individuals in it. So let's weight that observation basically by 100. Whereas if you have one small group with 5 folks in it, you can imagine a simple case like that, reporting the data in such different ways, from either the 2-group summary or what's called the experienced, which is trying to basically weight it by the individuals within that group. And so that's I would say it's a pretty, it can have drastic differences in terms of how we do this essential job of quantifying society, So I was wondering if when you approach that same issue, for example, when you're looking at the reintroduction of an individual into the group, and you're trying to assess how does this shift of one individual impact social level phenomena, group level phenomena. I can imagine that also arising in that case. You could say, well, what the path diagrams that you showed, or the network diagrams you showed, definitely there was a lot more aggression towards the bottom, right? But it was all aggression to the one reintroduced former top ranked, now bottom of the pile individual. And so it's kind of a perspective shift if you were to say, let's quantify this group level structure, but let's do so in terms of of the total amount of individual strategies that are going on, how much of a shift really is there versus if you're looking at it sort of weighted by how many, I don't know the terminology, but how many alters are involved in this. So if you sort of aggregate the data slightly differently, you might come out with a different overall measure of the social. Do you have any, does the theory in the question give you any kind of preference for sort of representing the group level phenomena one way or the other in that case or in general?
So one thing we have tried is, if we take out for the reintroduced bird, right, when it comes in at the bottom of the hierarchy, it's getting tons of aggression. If we take out all of the aggression that involves that bird, then what is the group level strategy? And at that level, it stays the same, right, as it was before. They're just following a hierarchy, but they seem to hate that reintroduced bird. And so just taking that bird out and that bird's data out then reverts the strategy back to just the basic hierarchy following. And so the shift to the bullying pattern seems to be really driven by behaviors directed against that one particular individual rather than a subset of individuals at the bottom of that hierarchy. And so we can kind of play with it that way and see, is it one individual that's driving or responsible for this pattern emerging, or is it kind of a more general kind of pattern? One thing you might want to think about, with the captive birds is nice because they're just stuck there, right? We get like mini kind of fission and fusion events where they're going over here, they're going over there, but these playpens are not huge. And so they're all kind of stuck there. So one thing we don't have to deal with as much is those changes in the group sizes. But one thing that might be interesting from your perspective, I really like this idea. Do you know Gabriel Ramos Fernandez's work on fission fusion groups? And he's worked with a lot of different primate species, but he has this really nice measure of social uncertainty, he calls it. And it looks at not the size of the groups alone, but the composition of the groups. So essentially looking at the sets of individuals that are within those groups. So consistently, do you have the same individuals that you're hanging out with, or are those sets kind of, or components of those sets changing quite a bit? So looking from each individual's perspective is how uncertain are you to be interacting with the consistent same other individuals. And that might be a really cool perspective to layer onto kind of this changing in the group size, is you could have individuals that are consistently experiencing group sizes of 5, right? But it's a very different social system. If those are your 5 favorite buddies, right? And you're always hanging out together versus, those 5 could be kind of, random people that you're just going and exploiting the same resources with or something.
Right. So it's like it sounds like a kind of spatiotemporal clustering or stickiness between individuals.
Yeah. So, you can definitely think of it.
Yeah. So
similar to that.
Could you repeat the author's name of that study, plees?
Sure. It is, I can just put it in the chat. Gabrielle Ramos Fernandez. And this is the social, whoops, can't spell. There we go. I think I've got his name correct there. Yeah, that looks right.
Yeah, that would be wonderful to run those kinds of analyses, because I've, with the GPS data I collect also, you've got just massive data processing issues here. Essentially, we're oversampling. It's not a terrible problem to have, but it is a problem to like.
You do have to figure out. And I think that this is like classically, right? You would not have the opportunity to know who's who in some of these animal or potentially these human groups too, right? And so it's a lot easier to just count and be like, yep, that's 5 individuals. And so it's only recently with this kind of like onboard technology that we're able to track individuals at a certain granularity to really know who's where and who are they hanging out with kind of in this real-time environment. So you have a lot more data just on individualized points in your data sets. And so something like this could push you much more in that direction.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. I appreciate that. So hi Alex. He's Alex is one of our admitted students to the grad program.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
Putting like a good face to the Beck group that we have here. We want to encourage participation, and I'm really glad that you asked the question. That was great, Alex.
That's awesome.
Do you or Tlali, do you have any follow-up topics to discuss with Liz at all?
No. Okay. I will contact you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Can you say it again? I think you're lagging a little or freezing or something.
Yeah, I think she just froze.
Yeah. I did want to pass on, if anybody's interested in following the social drama in real time for the parakeets, is my grad student Claire has a Twitter thread where she's been posting pictures and updates on all of the relationship drama, which is the field crew is so funny. They observe the behaviors all day long, right? And take down all the data. And then apparently they go back to the shared housing for dinner and they just debrief about all the data. It's like, did you see what happened today? I can't believe it. And make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. So it's just parakeet social drama all the time.
Yeah, that sounds so familiar.
And the parakeets must be very loud, right?
They are very loud. Yes.
Do you I don't know, from your description of the social group when you were talking with Dan about the base, it sounds like central place foraging. They're going out and looking for resources and then coming back. Is there I'm curious to think in, the sort of more naturalistic context where the birds are out foraging for foods, how either the partnership role that you're detecting by who's, socially associated with others, or potentially also the dominance hierarchy. How does that play out in terms of either who goes and forages with whom, or if there's any kind of, you didn't discuss information sharing, but I wonder if that's also going to creep in at some stage, either into your work or is something that we know enough about the natural history of the bird to think about how sharing in a sort of more naturalistic environment might occur.
That was originally what I was going to do my PhD on. And then I got down to Argentina and was like, wow, they call them La Plaga for a reason, right? There are a million of them everywhere. And so it was totally impossible to catch and mark enough birds that I could tell anything about the social structure. So for example, I think I caught 27 birds and marked them over the course of the whole field season. And I'd be observing a foraging flock of, 100 birds, and my one marked bird would show up. I'd be like, yes, I won the lottery today. I saw one marked bird, but like, who are all these other guys? So it's really hard to tell something about the social structure and the information sharing when you don't have a really densely marked population. And so at least initially, I really went away from that question because it was just totally impossible with the density of the birds that are in the native range. I think experiments like that are more possible in some of these feral populations where you have an artificially reduced density of the birds or like overall reduction in total population size. But then you're dealing with capturing birds in an urban environment and following them, which has its own problems. So yeah, ideally, it would be really interesting to look at information transfer. The most I was able to do in the native range was to look at kind of call down behavior. So in some parrots, foraging flock is relatively cryptic and hard to spot for other birds that are flying by. And so if they've found a good foraging resource, on these fruits that are hard to determine if they're, just ripe enough, the birds that are foraging will often call to flying flocks. And then those flying flocks are almost certainly going to join the calling flock in the tree. And the calling flock is pretty selective on who they're calling to for these flying flocks. They're not calling to everybody. And so what we were thinking in this other species is that might be a really good indication of targeted information sharing about these more cryptic foraging resources. The parakeets don't do any kind of call down behavior that I was able to record. So I was only there in the winter, right? So in the winter, they forage in these rangeland habitats on pastures, right? And so they eat the grass seeds and the grass roots. They fly over to the sunflower fields and then they come back. And so it's not hard for them to find the food. It's everywhere. They do seem to prefer to forage in flocks. But there's almost never a call down type pattern that's easy to detect. Usually that foraging flock is quiet and a flying flock will come down and kind of crash their party. There's a lot of aggression and then it kind of calms down again, but there's almost no calling in between. So it seems more like scrounging behavior rather than targeted information sharing. Okay. But, for novel resources, I mean, sometimes you do get, on these ranches, right, a grain bag of grain might spill, right? And there's a pile of grain there. And that might be a case where the parakeets would, fly back to the colony and do some recruitment calling and bring the birds back. They do a little bit of what looks like recruitment calling. So you'll get a bird that'll fly away from the colony, kind of giving this zippy little, what sounds like a recruitment call. And if he gets a couple 100 meters out and nobody's following, it's really funny because he just like very dejectedly like U-turns and comes back to the colony and like abandons the foraging attempt. So it does seem like there's the potential for active recruitment. But that's about as much as we know in the wild. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, recruitment is such a fascinating thing. It goes into the discussions about evolution of language and something I mean, I'm in the kind of the flip side situation with my research with the Hadza. It's obvious that there's recruitment going on. It's going on all the time. But I oftentimes try to take an approach where I'm almost trying to take the perspective of somebody who doesn't have that insider language understanding and is just trying to deduce whether there's recruitment going on, from like a bird's eye view perspective. So processing the GPS data to be able to see, here's an example, for example, where on day one, individual A goes to some location, and then you could look at everything that happens on day two and see, model the probability of an individual going there, with some kind of null model of movement and trying to make inferences like that about who may have been sharing information with whom, that'd be a fun little exercise to try to do. Yeah, that'd be cool. I think that's more
along the lines of things that, yeah, biologists and obviously with insects, there's so much work on recruitment as well.
Yeah. Well, if we get that big grant, we can model it.
I would be so much fun to do that. I really want to. Yeah, that would be a nice one to look at, because and there's a lot of potential too to look at like leader follower dynamics as well, you know, and that will be and such a great way to kind of combine perspectives across animal behavior and human behavioral ecology.
Yeah, for sure.
A lot of fun. Yeah,
That'd be pretty cool. Fingers crossed. We'll see.
Yeah. You look like you're pretty flush with funding though right now. I mean, I saw a lot of logos there.
So we've got funding for the bat stuff. So I'm coming in as kind of the computational person with Jerry's vampire bat project. Great. So it is partially funding like some of our computational stuff that's generalizing over to the parakeet system too. But we don't have the parakeet system funded right now. So I am fundraising like crazy for that because my startup is out this year. So I have to kick in some big funding to make sure that we can keep that work supported. And then the funding for the more kind of educational type research they're more like small seed grants. So it's getting that off the ground and letting us, you know, hire a programmer and get that kind of worked up to the point that we could make it really customizable and put in all the bells and whistles. But even that's going to need more funding to get past that initial point.
Yeah, as you know, it's expensive to hire developers.
I know.
It's like,
I mean, people are expensive, just budgets. Oh my goodness, budgets are terrible.
Yeah. And there's only so much in the day too, you know, for the coding. I mean, I hope that we will have that chance to follow up, find all these interesting topics that we could work on across systems. It would be such a fantastic opportunity. And there's another thing you might think about just in terms of like where the money's at these days, you know, obviously with the pandemic, there's such a large funding effort across NSF, NIH for research in disease ecology, you know, and that's another area where your network analyses and your studies of social proximity could have, you know, an impact as well.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask you too about is the issue about whether you were looking at body weight as a predictor of rank or changes in rank. Is there, just to play devil's advocate here on the side of the people who always ask you, well, maybe it is an individual trait, but you haven't measured it yet. So that part of my brain did start just because, you know, in the natural systems that we observe, you know, things equilibrate in a way where we don't often observe these kind of like rare events or hazards or health insults that can have so much of an impact, you know. So for example, you know, in the wild or probably also in captivity, you just might have a bird get sick and well, speaking of bird flu, right? You have a bird get sick and you see this rare but drastic reduction of body weight. That could also have like this immediate impact on how it's treated by others. I mean, that in primates, that's definitely the case. It's really sad. You can see group members turn on you know, sick individuals. How would you take in that kind of a you know, just a perspective on, well, maybe body weight does matter, but there's like a range only that you can explore these things by looking at observational data.
And it might be that if you're within the normal range, then body weight really isn't, you can't determine anything or predict rank. But once you get out of that, right, especially if you drop below that, that's when it becomes really critical. So I've really set it up for simplicity as kind of this either or kind of system. Either it's individual characteristics or it's purely social. But in reality, it's probably a blend of those two. But for the parakeets, it looks like it's much more on the social side than the characteristic side. So there's some really cool work on sparrows actually investigating these flips between when you're using individual characteristics and when you're using social information. So Dai Shizuka was involved in this project. And I think first author is Alec Jane, I think. But what they were doing is going into these sparrows that have a feather pattern that indicates their essentially their rank in the hierarchy. And going in and manipulating that feather patch to make it look like they're higher ranked or lower ranked than they actually are. And what happens is in a group where everybody knows each other, they disregard that manipulated signal. How they're like, I know that your mark says this, but like, we don't believe it. But if they're strangers, they go with the manipulated signal. And so there seems to be a difference between, do you know the individual? And if you do, default to what you know about that individual, right? With the relationships and the social memory. If you don't know that individual, just go with whatever you can perceive, which is the signal. Yeah. So it's this really nice indication of kind of going back and forth between these two information sources, which is really cool. So that's been really fun work to see how they're experimenting with that.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before with the covert signaling, right? It's like, when do you trust a signal versus when do you trust what you know about the person and your social history with them?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Have you thought of doing any kind of, I mean, you mentioned the challenges of studying the kind of foraging in naturalistic settings. I can just imagine how difficult that would be. Is there anything that in terms of like information exchange, awareness of information that you've been thinking about doing in some of your experiments, or is you've bitten off enough to chew for a while?
Well, yeah, there is quite a lot that we're digging into already. But one thing on the information side that would be really interesting is with these hierarchies, who's critical for maintaining the information structure in the hierarchies. So that's one thing that we're really curious about, the middle ranked individuals in these groups. If we pull them out of the groups, one thing that we might see is if those individuals have really high betweenness in the group and are responsible for kind of the information and preserving the structure of the hierarchy and that information in the group, if we pull them out, then the hierarchy might crumble. Right. And so that'll be a really interesting way to test for that. So,
that's really exciting.
Sparsest hierarchy, right, is like your top guy fights with the second guy fights with the third one fights with the fourth one, and then breaking anybody in that chain then would cause for the information in that whole system to really get disorganized. So it'll be really fascinating to see what happens with that.
It sure will be. That's great.